Hi, this is Dan Heisman. We're continuing with our series of videos to help you play chess better. Today I thought I'd continue with the series of 20-minute exercises we did, but I thought I'd do one with a twist. In the other 20-minute exercises, I just did my best. I just looked at the board and started analyzing out loud for you for 20 minutes. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best, but I'm going to be a little more explanatory on what you should be doing and how I got there, rather than just doing it. So rather than just being an example, hopefully it'll be maybe an explanatory example. And I'm hoping I'll pick an interesting position. I like to pick positions at random so that I've never seen them before. If I pick them the ones that I've seen, then of course I'm already knowing what I'm thinking about, and that destroys the whole idea. So I try to pick things at random. I've been using the Paris tournament from last year. I think there's 100 and some games. So let's pick a game at random. I don't know. It's been in the low 90s, so let's pick a game like that, 92. All right, so let's type in a 92 here in the library, and we'll get out a game. Examine Paris 19% 92. Grishik against Nakamura, 5-3 game. Okay, so we need to find a move. All right, well, we don't want to move this in the opening like the first 15 moves, and we don't want to move like move 80 because the game probably didn't go that far. So let's pick move 26 for Grishik, White's 26th move. If it's a recapture or something silly, we'll go to like move 27. So let's go ahead and take the game. Let's see what they did. We got a d4 game, Indian, possible Nimzo Indian, Bogo Indian, transposing into Queen's Gambit, now Catalan system, okay. Bishop back to e7, bishop g2, castle, castle, knight bd7, queen c2, knight e4, bishop f4. Notice they both have more than 5 minutes left, so this is all booked for these guys. c6, knight c3, g5, provocative move by Naka, but he played it right away, probably a book move. Bishop e3. Grishik is now out of his book because he's all the way down to 4 minutes. b3, knight f4, hitting the bishop again, saves the bishop. Notice White is very reluctant to give up the bishop pair. It's not so much that he gets double pawns, it's that Black would win the bishop pair, not that the double pawns are nothing. So g4, knight e1, knight takes d4, queen d1. Looks like Naka's won a pawn here, but his king side's a little open, so Grishik has some compensation. Knight f6, giving back the pawn. Knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes. So now the material's back to even. We're looking for White's 26th move here, and then we're going to stop. So far, there's a break move on e4, although Black could go past it with d4. Now there's a pin on the c4 pawn. White takes, and Naka adds pressure to the c4 square. White finishes developing his pieces. Black gets his queen out. White moves his queen out of the pin. Black plays knight to c5. I like Black's position here, even though the g file is semi-open. Pawn takes. Bishop there to guard the h7 square in the diagonal. All right, so we're up to White's 26th move here. Let's do that. Okay. All right, so I could just take 20 minutes and just find a move, but let's talk about what we need to do. All right, first of all, we need to count the material. See what the material is. Right now, Black only has 5 pawns, White has 6. So White is up a pawn. Both sides have 2 bishops, so nobody has the advantage of the bishop pair. White is up a pawn. That pawn on d5 can always be traded for the pawn on e6, if worse comes to worse. Black has some compensation. He's got a nice bishop in the middle of the board. His knight on c5 is guarding it, but White can get rid of it by playing b4 at some point. All right, so we need to know, before we start looking at candidate moves for White, White needs to know what Black is doing and what White's doing. So let's start by asking ourselves, what in the world is Black doing here? Well, his rook on f8 is not doing very much, but his other pieces have pressure in the center. And there are some weak light squares in the middle of the board because the bishop on d3 is controlling a lot of light squares. The pawn on f2 is unguarded, but Black would have a little bit of trouble getting a second piece onto f2. I think black's just looking to play something like bishop g6 and drive the queen away from the king side, and then maybe develop the king rook. But black's down a pawn. If white can just trade everything off here, then white's in good shape. So black's trying to keep the pieces on the board. That's very, very important. When you're ahead in material, you want to trade pieces, not necessarily pawns. When you're behind in material, you want to keep the pieces on the board. So black's not looking to do a lot of trades here. He's looking to keep the game complicated. And if he could win back that pawn on d5, great. Right now, he probably can't. But he's keeping an eye on his counterplay all over the board. Okay, right now, black's not threatening anything. If white says I pass, and black, let's say, plays e takes d5, white can just recapture with a knight or the bishop, and he's fine. Black's not threatening to play bishop e2 or anything like that. Bishop g6 is not a threat. That's not trapping the queen. So black's not really threatening much, but he does have active pieces. All right, so let's look at what white's trying to do. Well, obviously with his move queen h5, white is saying that h-pawn is isolated. You know, if I can attack that pawn on the h-file, I've got a target. That's one of the reasons why black played his last move, bishop d3, to kind of grab that diagonal and make sure that white can't take advantage of the isolated h-pawn. So white was trying to do that with queen h5. Clearly white's trying to hang on to his pawn in the middle. And white's trying to figure out the best way to do that. If he takes the pawn on e6, black may even take back with the f-pawn and open the file for the rook, so that the rook on f8 and the queen on f6 are attacking the pawn on f2, and white can't easily guard f2 with the rook because he can't play rook f1. The bishop on d3 is guarding that. So if black can pile up on that pawn and force white to take on e6, then maybe black could take back with the f-pawn and get some pressure on the f-file. So what is white trying to do? Well, he's trying to hold the pawn on d5 so he's up a pawn. He's trying to trade off pieces so he can win, you know, get less material on the board so the extra pawn will be a bigger factor. He has discovered attacks on the bishop on d3 with his bishop on d2, but the bishop on d3 is guarded, but I can take care of that by playing b4 and getting rid of the knight guarding the bishop on d3, but it's not clear that's going to win anything. White could play b4, and if the knight moves, he can move the bishop to g5, hitting the bishop on d3, and then there's complications. The queen could probably just guard, the queen on f6 could probably just guard the bishop on d3. So what is white trying to do? He's trying to trade off. He's trying to take advantage of that isolated h-pawn. He's trying to hold on to his pawn on d5. He's trying to take advantage of the fact that the bishop on d3 could be hanging if he gets rid of the knight. He's trying to take advantage of the fact that he has two rooks on the c and d files, and black doesn't yet have that. So for instance, if he could get that pawn on d5 up to d6 safely and guard it with his pieces, that might be a real threat, but nothing yet. All right, so we have a good overview of what both sides are trying to do. Why are we doing that? Because then we want to find candidate moves. For instance, since black's not threatening to play e takes d5, white doesn't necessarily have to make candidate moves that save the pawn on d5. He doesn't have to take on e6. He doesn't have to play d6. It doesn't mean that those moves are not good. It just means that they're not all that required at this point. So what else can white do? Can he take advantage of that isolated h-pawn in any way? Suppose he does move the bishop on d2. Where would he go? Well, he could go to g5 and hit the queen. So that's a candidate move. Bishop g5 is a candidate move. Does it do anything wonderful? No, black's just going to take the queen on f6 and put it somewhere else. But if he puts it on g6, you know, white could trade queens and say, let me go into the endgame up a pawn. I don't need to do anything fancy in the middle game if I'm up a pawn. So bishop g5, queen g6. If worse comes to worse, white can play queen takes g6, and then probably black would play h takes g6, taking the pawns toward the center. And white would be up a pawn. If white plays bishop to g5, black doesn't have to play queen g6. He could play queen f5 or queen e5. Don't think he can play queen d4, although it's not 100% ruled out, but it doesn't look right. So bishop g5 is a candidate move. When you see a candidate move, you know, you don't just say, that looks good, I'll play it. That's what beginners do. You say, all right, well, what are all my candidate moves? And I want to look at each one And if it's close, I'll look deeper and deeper. De Groot, in his book Thought and Choice in Chess, calls that progressive deepening. What you're trying to do if you have 4 candidate moves is you're trying to first identify them, then you're trying to look a little bit at each one, and then trying to eliminate them, use the process of elimination, until there's only one move left. And you only want to have to look deep enough to be able to eliminate the other moves. You don't need to look at your best move a million moves deep, unless it's some sort of sacrifice and you're trying to see if it works or not. All right, so bishop g5 is a candidate move. What else could white do? White could play, as we said, play b4. So let's look at that move b4. After b4, black could counterattack the queen with bishop g6 and then save the knight. That way he wouldn't worry about discoveries. So b4, bishop g6, what would white do with the queen? He could put it on a dark square like queen g5. He could put it on a light square like queen e2, but then the bishop could go back to d3 and try to repeat the position. But that could be dangerous. b4, bishop g6, queen e2, bishop d3. Now white can play queen e3, continuing to hit the bishop. But now if black saves the knight, white takes the bishop, queen takes d3. And if black doesn't save the knight, then white takes the knight. So it looks like b4, bishop g6, queen e2, bishop d3, queen e3 doesn't look very good for black. I mean, maybe he's got a move there, but I don't think after bishop g6 playing the bishop back to d3 is a good move. So b4, bishop g6, queen e2, black could just move the knight now. He could play knight to d3. Knight to d3 makes more sense because he's hitting the rook. And if the rook goes off the c-file, then the rook becomes weaker and the knight on c3 becomes weaker. And if the rook goes up to c2, it's kind of a hanging rook. And when that knight moves, he's hitting the rook on c2. For instance, knight f4 hits the queen and the rook, although white has bishop takes f4. So we'll look at the line. We're looking at the line b4, bishop g6, queen e2, knight d3, rook c2, knight f4, bishop takes f4, bishop takes c2, queen takes c2. And I think white is okay. Can black then play rook takes c3? Rook takes c3, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3. Queen takes c3, bishop takes c3, and he wins 2 pieces for rook, and he just won 2 pieces for rook. So when the smoke clears, it looks like they're almost all the same. Huh. Well, white's not going to do that anyway. So we're not going to waste a lot of time on that. So b4, bishop g6. And then the knight's going to go to d3 and hit the f2 pawn, even if the queen's on e2, and make the rook move. So maybe I don't want to hit the knight. Maybe that's black's threat. Maybe black wants to play bishop g6 followed by knight d3. Maybe we've decided that is a threat. Well, that means that maybe I want to move my bishop right away because if I move the bishop right away, he moves the bishop. My rook's also guarding d3. So bishop g5 hits the queen. Black does not have time to play knight d3 now because the bishop takes f6. So bishop g5. And the idea is to put my rook on the d3 square, not so much to win the bishop, but so that if he plays bishop g6 in some line, well, I can't play bishop g6 right away because I'll take the queen on f6. Then he takes my queen, and then I trade everything off, and that's pretty much winning for white. So bishop g5, he has to move the queen. And now my rook has an eye on d3. Maybe, well, it depends on where he moves the queen. On bishop g5, if he plays queen f5, I might have bishop h3. Interesting idea. Trying to get out of that pin of the bishop on g5 to the queen. What else could white do? White could just offer a trade of queens. He could play queen f3. And then if queen takes f3, bishop takes f3. When the black bishop moves from d3 to threaten knight d3, white has time to keep an eye on that square. He's got several moves he could do that with. Okay. So queen f3 is a candidate move. Just trying to keep an eye on d3 and offer the trade of queens. Bishop g5 is a candidate move. Notice how I found that idea of black playing bishop g6 followed by knight d3 sort of by process of elimination. I said, basically, what happens if I hit that knight with b4? And then I realized I'm helping him play bishop g6 followed by knight d3, which tells me that now I shouldn't even be thinking about playing b4 yet. I should be thinking more about overloading on the d3 square a little bit. So, as I said, queen f3 is a candidate, bishop g5, d takes e6. I have to analyze each one and compare them with the other ones, see what position I'm going to get. And once I get to that position, I have to compare it to the other positions that I could get to. So for instance, let's do that with bishop g5 versus another move like queen f3. So when you look at bishop g5, you can't say, I don't care where he moves the queen. Well, it makes a difference. If he plays queen g6, I don't think you have any problems. You just trade queens and you're up a pawn. So he's probably going to play something like pinning the bishop with queen e5 or queen f5. That makes a lot more sense. If he plays queen f5, I hate to bring my bishop off the long diagonal by playing bishop h3, but I can. What else could I do on bishop g5, queen f5? Bishop g5, queen f5. My bishop's pinned to my queen, and he's threatening to push a pawn and attack the bishop on g5. I could play g4, but that looks a little icky. Bishop h3 looks a little better. Bishop g5, let's say he plays queen e5. He's still not threatening to take my pawn on d5. I could then play rook e1 and try to get out of the pin that way. So bishop g5, queen e5, rook e1. I'm not sure White's making any great progress there, but it doesn't look bad. If he plays queen f5, I can still play bishop h3, I think. And now he is running out of squares that would cause me any problems. So that's not bad. Let's say we just play queen f3 here. Suppose we play queen f3, and if he moves the queen, I have plenty of time to do anything I want. I could move the bishop on d2 and attack the bishop on d3 more, and he can't go bishop e4 because I have knight takes e4. So let's say he trades queens. Queen f3, queen takes f3, bishop takes f3. Does he have any way to take advantage of that? Can he move the bishop on d3 and then play knight d3? So queen f3, queen takes f3, bishop takes f3. Let's say he plays bishop g6. Now he's guarding that square, and if I play bishop e3, he can just play knight d3 anyway, and it's going to be a little awkward trying to guard my knight because his bishop on g7 is attacking my knight, and I can't put the rook on c2. Well, if I put the rook on c2, he has a discovery with the knight, which doesn't look pleasant. So queen f3, queen takes f3, bishop takes f3, bishop g6, threatening knight d3. I guess I could move the knight on c3 then. Let's say I play... My bishop on f3 is guarding d5. So let's say I play knight to b5. He can't take it with the bishop because his bishop has moved back to g3. If he then plays knight d3, I can trade rooks and maybe even win the a-pawn. Although if I play rook takes c8, knight takes a7, he can play rook to a8, and if I save my knight with knight to c6 or something, he can play rook takes a2. Interesting. All right, so Naka does have some play here. If he can get that knight to d3, I mean, oops. That's not good for the video to have the screen go blank. That's what happens if you don't use the monitor in a long enough time. That doesn't happen to me. I think the last time that happened to me when I was making a video was quite a few years ago. All right, so bishop g5 isn't bad. Queen f3 looks a little iffy. What other candidates can White play? He could play bishop to e3. with the idea of even taking the knight. I mean, he's threatening to take the knight right away and win the bishop. So we could play bishop e3, and if he plays bishop g6, we can play queen e2. And that looks pretty good. Bishop e3. Bishop g6 is almost forced because I'm threatening to win the bishop. Queen e2. And then he can't play knight d3 because of simply rook takes d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, winning 2 pieces for a rook. Because then at the end of that, does he have rook takes c3? He might. He might indeed. Bishop e3, bishop g6, queen e2, knight d3, rook takes d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, rook takes c3, rook takes c3, queen takes c3, queen takes c3, bishop takes c3, and now I lose. He's gotten... First I won 2 pieces for rook, and then he won a piece, so he's won the exchange. So if you don't follow that, let's look at that. We're looking at bishop e3, bishop g6, queen here, knight here, rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes, rook takes, queen takes, queen takes, bishop takes. Well, originally white was up a pawn, but now black has a rook for a bishop, so black has the exchange for the bishop pair, so I was correct. Black is winning the exchange if I play that line. So that's not so great. So when he plays bishop g6, if I move the queen back and he plays knight d3, he's threatening my rook on c1 and he's threatening my knight on c3. I guess in some lines, just moving the knight on c3 to another square helps, but I really don't have a lot of great squares. Knight b1 is pretty ugly. Knight a4 is also ugly. Knight b5 is not safe. Knight e4 is not safe. Knight e2 doesn't look very good. I guess it's playable. Knight e2, if he plays bishop g6 and I move the queen and then he plays knight d3, I could play rook takes rook. So I guess knight e2 is playable, but I'm not sure he could do that. So again, what am I doing here? I'm analyzing the moves. I'm looking to say, if I make this move, what's he going to do? And I'm looking for his checks, captures, and threats on how he's going to win material. And I'm trying to decide by comparing moves like bishop g5 or bishop e3 or queen f3 or knight e2. I'm trying to compare, what's going to happen on those various moves to see which one leads to a position that I like the best. All right, well, I could continue this for a while, but what I want to do now is let's see what Grishik played, and then let's see how that compares with what Stockfish says, because these Grandmasters are pretty good. Even though they only have 5 minutes for the whole game in a 3-second increment, and Grishik's down to 119, he's probably doing a lot of the things I just did for you in a much faster and much more accurate rate. So let's see what Grishik played. He did play bishop g5. Well, that's a move we looked at about as much as any other move. And now we expected a move like queen to f5 or something. And he took a lot of time on that move. Wow, he took about half his time, 119 down to 45. So he thought that was a pretty critical position. So I was lucky. I picked out a very critical one this time. All right, so I'm expecting black to move the queen up to the 5th rank. Naka does. Now we're expecting maybe a move like rook to e1 or something. No, he just moves the queen out of the pin. Black does move the bishop back, again going for that knight d3 idea. Grishik's a little short on time. He attacks the queen again. Naka says, I'm willing to trade queens even though I'm down a pawn. Grishik says, I can get my knight up there and keep an eye on these 2 key squares. Naka says, well, at least I'm going to isolate your pawns on the king side. There's that knight d3 move we kept talking about, hitting the rook and the bishop. He's going to pretty much have to take that rook, which he does. Now he's got to save the bishop, which he does. And Naka says, let me hit your rook again. Those 2 bishops are really powerful. Okay. White counterattacks the rook. Naka says, I'll just go to the e file. White says, I'll go to the open file. Black says, I'll take the pawn. White says, I'll recapture, and now white's up 2 pawns. Still harassing the rook. White says, good, I'm up 2 pawns, let's trade. Black counterattacks the bishop and the pawn. He says, let me get rid of the bishop pair. get rid of the... It's not a bishop pair. Bishop pair is the advantage of the bishop pair. Now white has the bishop pair, but black can take off the bishop and be up a piece. But it's white's turn, of course, and he's going to preserve the bishop pair by moving that bishop on d5, which he does. Black says, at least I get a pawn out of this. White says, well, now I get a pawn. He gives back his doubled isolated pawns. White's got the bishop pair and an extra pawn. That knight on a2 is stuck. This is theoretically should be winning for white. He wants to keep that bishop pair. Black's trying to trade it off. Both sides are down to 10 seconds, but nobody's going to lose on time. They got plenty of time here. That pawn has come running down the board. And bishop there. He must think he's in Zugzwang. No, he's just walking around. And he says, I can't win with that pin. He says, you can get out of the pin. Both sides are really short on time. Holds the pawn. The knight says, I can't take that bishop. Hits the bishop, hits the check. Bishop stays on the board. This is a lot easier position to play when you have the bishops than it is. So now black's in trouble because if that white bishop gets to that f4 square, it's going to be all over. So he threatens that pawn. Going to be really, really hard to guard. This is almost over now. Guards the pawn. That lets the king have a place to come in. Bishop finally takes, now he's up 2 pawns. He says, go ahead and take my other pawn. Thanks for the free bishop, and black resigns. He was losing anyway. All right, so let's go back to where we were. 55 moves back. That's like saying back 110. All right, so right here, let's ask Stockfish, what's the top 3 moves? We'll make the board smaller so you can see the analysis. Okay, so some of the moves we talked about are in there right now. Bishop e3 we looked at. It does say white's winning. White's up that extra pawn. It says he could just play d6 and push that past pawn, which we talked about as being not necessary, but not bad. Stockfish says it's not only not necessary and not bad, it's actually good. So d6, b4, the move that I thought he would play bishop g6, queen e2, and then maybe knight d3. Stockfish says that doesn't work. So let's look at that. That's right now, that's number 1. b4, bishop g6, queen e2 is forced to try to guard the square. And now if knight to d3, that loses to knight to e4, removing the guard on the knight and hitting the queen. Aha. So obviously here black has to take that knight. He can't afford to move the queen. If he tries to move the queen and guard the knight, let's say he plays queen to d4, then white can play rook takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop e3, removing the guard on the queen. If the queen goes to c4, we just take off the knight, and we win a piece. So let's go all the way back to the start. So we're looking at b4, bishop g6, queen e2, knight d3, knight here. So I think he has to take it. So let's see what happens if he takes it. Bishop takes. So now we can't take the bishop because he'll take the rook and hit my queen. So we have to take here. By the way, we should also point out he can't take the rook first because we take the queen with check and then we save our queen. So we can't do that. So we're looking at bishop takes, rook takes, and then the bishop takes, hitting the knight. And now when he saves the knight, let's say he attacks the rook, yeah, we just offer the trade of rooks. And what's happening here is the position, white now has the bishop pair, and he still is up a pawn, and black hasn't gotten anywhere. So it actually turns out this accentuates white's advantage. And the computer has the white up about 3 pawns worth here. All right, we can stop the analysis. So it turns out that the move bishop g5 that we looked at is not as good as the move b4 that we thought wasn't as good. But then the computer is much better than Grishik, and Grishik is much better than me. So, you know, sometimes the computer can see all these things that we humans, especially in time trouble, can't see. I'm sure Grishik would tell you, he'd say, hey, I only had 1:29 on the clock and I took 40 seconds. What do you want? So we sympathize with him. All right, so it was a good game. And as we said at the end, finally, Grishik won the game against Naka. which I'm sure make Grishik feel good because, Naka's one of the great speed players in the world. I think his blitz rating is right up there with Carlsen's. In rapid chess, when you go to that intermediate time controls like 15 to 30 minutes, Naka's still up there. I think he's second or third or fourth in the world. Carlsen's first there too. But at blitz times, Nakamura and Carlsen are right there at the top. So, anytime you beat Naka in a 5-3 game, you're feeling pretty good. Okay, for my YouTube channel, I guess I should put the board back to where it's centered again. For my YouTube channel, if you liked it, if you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe will allow you to hit the like button. I was taught by someone that liking is a lot easier when you're a subscriber. Okay, and hopefully you'll tune in again and tell your friends about our channel. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye.